The last session for CEM 2021 is a CX experts panel discussion, which is going to be talking on scaling up the delivery of innovations in customer experience through effective dissemination, strategies and models, and perhaps creating a customer centric future. The panelists are Lizette Akers, CX design lead from RMB Private Bank, South Africa, Roland D. Naidu, customer operations executive, MultiChoice South Africa, Seema Matthew, Non-Executive Director, Customer Experience South Africa, and the moderator is Steve Tars, Process Management and Customer Experience Enabler from USA. Welcome everyone to the panel.
Thank you, Pooja. Great introduction. So we're going to have a really good panel and a finale for the conference, and I've got people who I regard as being, my mentors, if you like, in terms of what they're doing in transforming the customer experience performance in across Africa, not just in South Africa, but across the whole domain of Africa. So what we're going to do first off is have the guys introduce themselves, and then I'll flip us over to the bullet point questions we've got. At the end of us sort of moderating and answering questions, what we'll do is turn it over back to Pooja, and then Pooja will collate any questions that have arisen from the delegates as we go through. So if we're okay with that, and looking at my screen now, I'm going to ask Lizette to introduce herself first, please.
Hi, everybody, and it's nice to be on the panel and nice to engage with our CX friends again, even though it's virtually. So thank you for having me. I think just for me, I think many people in the CX world might know me already, but I started my CX journey as a consultant, have been consulting for a number of years, and I've worked quite closely with Steve Towers, understand the methodology really well. Over the last 2 years, I've spent some time back in the corporate world and working at RMB in the corporate and institutional space, actually along with Mumbi, who you heard from earlier. And so I'm looking forward to the conversation. Thank you very much.
Cheers, Lizette. Roland, would you like to introduce yourself as well, please?
Yes, Steve. I'm loving the cap, by the way.
Right. Okay. Well,
it's a ray of sunshine. Yes, hi, everybody. I'm Roland Naju. I'm currently working in the operations space at MultiChoice, South Africa. I have not been a customer experience professional for that long. I don't regard myself as one. But what I can say is that when I first met Steve, how much I disliked him for making me not want to be an engineer much longer. And since then, we've actually become friends. And this CX space, I think, needs more people with more enthusiasm, like yourself, Steve, and like the other guys in the panel and in the conference. And to be fair, I'm actually moving back into the belief that the process is everything, and it's not just about the soft and fluffy measures.
Yeah, cool, good, and I'm sure you'll share some of the scar marks that you've received over the years of actually trying to implement some of that stuff. So I'm going to look forward to that. And last but not least, in terms of the panel, Seema, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Thanks, Steve. And good afternoon to everyone. And I've been in the experience industry for maybe about 10 years. And but I think I've been on this journey for a while because I started off in the data side, always on the customer side, analytics and that kind of thing. So I did a transition from the technical side into the customer experience side. And it's been interesting to see the journey the world has been in with regards to customer experience. And nice to see data coming back into the picture again. And I think there's a lot that can be done to make us all smarter companies and individuals. So look forward to this discussion, and I think it's going to be fun.
Yeah, and I think you're quite right, though, is there's much more objectivity coming into the space. And rather than it just be sentiment and observation, it is, that kicker I like to use is getting more scientific about the customer experience. So let's flip into our agenda. Okay, so give everybody sort of an idea of how these bullet points came to be. BP Group, as you know, I represent the not-for-profit. We do annual surveys and things like that, and every so often themes bubble forward. And of course, the ones that have been taking all our attention in the last few months has been, how do we get out of this pandemic? And when we do get out of this pandemic, how are we going to recover? And for all of us who are in the customer experience space, we're facing this directly because, as we know, customers have changed, their needs have changed. So these bullet points were ones that were sort of surfacing over the last sort of 6 months. And I thought, well, let's hear it from the horse's mouth. People who are actually having to deal with this at a corporate and a community level. And now this is how the pandemic has changed our approaches and how it's informing us for the future. So Seema, you were the last person there to introduce yourself. So do you want to take that first bullet point there? What are the biggest challenges facing the successful implementation of a customer-centric culture?
So I've been in various industries, banking, IT, insurance, and now as part of an association. And the key difficulties I see in implementing the culture is, I think at the top lies, the leadership commitment. And a lot of companies and leaders, I think the talk is there. I think, but the real test is actually when you commit to the improvements that need to be done. And I think for me, one of the biggest, the starting point is the reviewing of the company's foundational elements. So is your vision still the same vision as what you had before? Because there's a customer-centric way of looking at it, and there's a non-customer-centric way. So things like that need to be reviewed. Is your values going to help you reach that customer-centric vision that you've created? So I think there's the foundational elements that need to be looked at, and then it's pretty much all the investments that you need to support the actual implementation. And part of that becomes things like change management. I mean, change doesn't happen in 1 year. To change a whole organization, it will take 5 years or more. And the willingness to commit to that and putting the right KPIs in place to enable us to get there. So there's a lot of discussions around that need to be held. And I think we're living in a very fortunate time now because technology allows us to break down silos and actually work together to co-create together, ideate together. So we're living in very fortunate time. I think we just have to optimize use of these technologies to take advantage of the opportunities that we actually have.
Yeah, and I think you've hit the nail on the head there, where you're sort of saying is the value system, because that drives all the behaviours in an organisation. And how is that being revisited? As we know, we're getting lots and lots of examples of really well-focused customer-centric companies. And in your experience, how are those best practices being internalised, Seema? Is there a place to start? You've mentioned KPIs, for instance, the changing the sort of management mindset, the breaking down silos. So is there one place that you would sort of say, if you focus your attention in this area to start off with, you'll make more progress than you otherwise would?
I think the starting point is going back to the staff and doing research with the staff, engaging with the staff to get their perspective on it. Because if you don't get their buy-in with regards to the change that you want to make, you're not going to be as successful as a company where they actually engage the staff. And it's almost like creating a movement with the staff and not this whole authoritative figure coming and telling you what to do. Making people wanting to be part of that change. I mean, how did Me Too go around the whole world? Because there were passionate people who were driving it. Same thing happened now with regards to climate change and everything. I mean, you get a Greta, who's in school, but she was able to mobilize people because she's working from that emotion. And I think CX professionals, experienced professionals, we know all about emotion. And we well placed to actually tackle these kind of issues because we know what is the right way to tackle it. And I think it's by educating the leaders, giving them the opportunity to do that. I think what happens is that often there's a huge gap between where the practitioners are sitting and the actual leaders who are making the decision of what is prioritized. As soon as we bridge that gap, I think a lot more of what needs to happen will start happening.
Yeah, and that's great. It's about, and, to use a quote that gets used quite a lot. I like Nelson Mandela's, leading from behind idea, is that, letting the people go on ahead and actually, forge the path. And only when need be, and trouble sort of comes down the path is to get to the front again and actually show and demonstrate, that great leadership. So great point, Seema. Lizette, I'm going to pick on you to answer the same question, and just contextually, when we first met all those many years ago, and you were a sort of a poacher of business in organizations, and latterly, as you said, in the last couple of years, you've become a gamekeeper. So you've got a really valued perspective there. So how would this work for RMB, and in particular your experience of helping organizations get customer centricity?
So I think if I reflect on the challenges we've had at RMB over the last 2 years, in terms of driving client centricity, I think there's a lot of conversation around client centricity. Everybody wants to, in principle, be client centric, but not everybody understands what it truly means. So I think that they almost say, yes, we want to be client centric, but let's add it onto our existing stuff. I don't think there's this real penny drop in terms of saying, well, fundamentally, everything must change. We need to rethink our strategic objectives. We need to rethink our culture and our values and make sure that everything then is aligned. I think you mentioned yesterday in your keynote about alignment and making sure that everything you do in the organization aligns to those key objectives. So for me, one of the things that we continue to work on a daily basis internally is to try and connect those dots across the organization of saying, well, you said you want to be client-centric. Here are your strategic objectives. Here's how client centricity plays out. And that's how we connect the dots. How does a successful client outcome align to your business objective? Seema, you were talking about emotions. And let me tell you, a bunch of bankers in the corporate world, they don't really think much about emotion. They want to know hard facts. They want to know data. They want to know the rands and cents. So the only way forward for us is to speak their language. And so although we know at the base of it, experience is about a personal thing. It's at the core of it, it's the emotion that you drive. And being a trusted partner is one of our key objectives. Now, trust is not just created through rands and cents. Certainly there is a big financial component in a banking world, but trust is about, do you, at the end of the day, person to person, really trust who you are engaging and who you are working with on a day-to-day basis. So we know we need that trust. We know we need that emotional outcome, but we need to engage our stakeholders and our leadership in a language that they understand. So how does that then translate to cost efficiencies and to financial outcomes for the business? And I think for me, that's the easiest way forward to direct what we're trying to do with client experience, because in many instances, we're trying to build a capability and it requires a lot of foundational work and it doesn't always deliver benefits from day one. So we've got to balance this need to show results, to keep people inspired with client experience and client centricity, but at the same time to keep people engaged and make them feel as though this is also contributing towards their outcomes and their scorecard at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I think that point that you made there in terms of delivering against we might disagree with the value system at the moment, but the way to get into that discussion is to demonstrate how you're aligned to the results that they're valuing, but at the same time to then begin to move those KPIs so that they are much more customer centric driven, but at the same time deliver to the bottom line, and we're trying to bridge that gap, as we know, there's a science to it, but it's more of an art than a science. And it requires, I think, all of us in the CX space to become, almost like magicians or chameleons, if you like. We're able to have conversations with different people and articulate it in the way that they would understand. So Nice points, Lizette. Roland, I'm going to come to you, but just before I do that, because like the organisation you work for is sort of multinational and is right the way across the continent, not just reflecting on it from your perspective of where you are at the moment, but how's this playing out across the continent at the moment?
Phew. I think, Steve, we don't necessarily see ourselves as South Africa and the rest of the continent. From a culture perspective, our group CEO is very strong on the fact that this is one company, one brand, and we serve our customers entirely. So, when we look at values, I think Seema touched on it earlier, values and behaviors. Everyone is held to account, from group CEO right through the organization, and everyone is given the mandate to call it out when we don't follow the behaviors. It's very interesting though, because culturally it can be quite difficult given that we operate in 49 countries. The language barriers are quite significant, but what you do get when you speak customer is a common thread, right? And a common understanding of what needs to be done. And as difficult as it has been for what we want to call CX professionals, I think everyone in an organization is a CX professional, is because of this language, everyone can come together and start talking about the same thing. I don't know finance to save myself from a bad car accident, right? But I do know customers. Everyone knows customers because we're all customers. And so I think the commonality in the language starts to change the culture, whether you like it or not. And I'm seeing it across the continent now. Everybody is just talking customer.
Yeah. And I think one of the points you were making there is about that, we're all CX professionals because we're all customers. And so we have some perspective on that. And I really liked Tony Hsieh, the former CEO of Zappos over in the States, when he reminded us that CX isn't a department, it's actually a mindset. And how do we share that with everybody? How do we spread the word? And I think it's a combination of what both Seema and Lizette were saying in there in terms of, yes, it's the customer journey is an emotion and things like that. But if we haven't engineered it, if we haven't sort of created it in such a way that it delivers some specific outcomes, then it doesn't have an end in itself. So yeah, that's great. And I like that point there about 49 different countries. It must feel like you're herding cats sometimes, trying to get everybody in the same place.
No comment. Steve, I do want to say something on the Tony Hsieh example, and something both the ladies touched on quite eloquently. I'm not as eloquent as you guys, forgive me. But we can't be waiting for CEO support. And we can't be waiting for executive sponsorship. My advice to anybody, and Steve and Lizette, you've walked this journey with me in this particular role I'm in. You've just got to do it and show results. We've got to leave the theory in the backpack at university. We just freaking do it. And it holds so much weight when you can go upstairs and have the discussion that says, I've saved 100 million Rand last year just by changing KPIs in my department. What do you want to do next? And it works. You can build such a groundswell because we have people, coming to us. My colleague Clint is actually messaging me on the side to say, stop being grumpy. But we assume, and the thing is, we assume that somebody else is going to do it. We need to kill that assumption and just start doing it.
Yeah, and I love that. One of the organisations I've worked with in the past, they used to sort of talk about, how do you get this thing, how do you get the show moving if you haven't already started? But when you've got the momentum, how do you keep it going? And one of the things they always said, and I think we've internalized it into some of the dialogue and discussion that we have, is let the doing of it become the advocacy to do more. So,
Yeah.
and you don't have a choice about where you start. You have to start where you are now. It'd be great if we all had a blank sheet of paper and we could start over again. But we know the world isn't like that. We're presented with problems and issues, and we have to solve them. But if we do that in such a way that customer centricity becomes the reason why, and it also delivers results simultaneously, and it pleases our shareholders, then we won't go too far wrong. So great start to that discussion. What I'll do is just flip back over to our screen in terms of the sort of second bullet point that we've got there. So I don't know who's going to take this one. I'm going to leave it open to the panel to actually grasp the magic wand. What would be the one thing you would do to actually help with CX adoption? What would that one thing actually be? So who's going to put themselves
I'd
in
like
the
to
lights?
start with 30 seconds. I would train every single person on the CX method in the organization. Everyone. Because, like you said, the culture and the language barriers start to disappear when everybody is starting to work off the same why and the same how. And it is a task, by the way, which Steve can attest to, that I have undertaken and started training every single person in this organization.
I think to add to that, Roland, I would love to be able to, but that takes some money, right? So one of the things that I think we need to do is seriously relook at the KPIs. If I could wave my wand, I would get rid of all of the rubbish internal KPIs, and I would just make everybody measured according to an outcome that they deliver for a client. And that includes these back office functions that think that they are very far removed from anything client experience, because everybody does have a role to play. And so for me, if you get what you measure, if you start measuring those right things, I think you'll be amazed at how much everything else just automatically will fall in line.
And of course, I like to pick on people who've said these things that have told us the right way. And I think it was Jeff Bezos in one of his videos, it would have been like 15 years ago, but he was saying if you can get outcome measures in place, most everything else gets fixed. But oftentimes our organisations are focused in that old industrial era way of just measuring the outputs. So I think, Roland, you did something in your world which was actually changing that measurement system. What was there anything specific you can share with people about that?
So, Lizette, you said some of these back office functions. I'm entirely a back office function, like literally. I have a technical team that ranges from advanced technologies like artificial intelligence and machine learning to the training department, which sits under me. And I've got about 120 to 150 people, depending on the time of year, in my department. Every single one of them has a customer KPI, and all of their KPIs say customer. But it didn't start there, and that's why I mentioned the training thing, because if the why is missing, I find like people just brush it off, like this is not a thing I want to do. So I think Steve is pointing to the fact that I nearly got fired for doing this. But I changed everybody. Like you're not going to be doing service level measurements. You're not going to measure handle times. We are going to focus on getting customers the right outcome at the right time. And even in the documented corporate KPIs, it says enable the customer, do this for the customer. Like they didn't digest it at the time, but as the results are coming in, and I was saying this earlier, they start to ask, like, why did you do this and how did you get there? And I think once that starts to click, you won the battle.
And a great perspective. And I'm going to come to Seema in a minute and talk about your magic wand from that community sense. But just to finish on that one, Roland, just in terms of reflecting on the journey and being in a back office function, I often hear on my sort of global travels virtually in the last 18 months is people still saying, look, but the customer's not my job. I'm doing this, I'm in the back office and I'm doing that. Whereas I think your example there, Roland, really demonstrates that everybody should be hooked into a successful customer outcome or a successful client outcome. And the process of doing that is to be able to, as you say, is demonstrate the value of it. It's not a case of it's wishful thinking or, we're going to put lipstick on the pig and then pretend it looks a lot nicer these days. No, it's a real fundamental shift. And Seema, coming to you, I mean, you're in the sort of the vanguard of this, waving that magic wand, because you're building that community and sharing those best practices. So how does that work for you? If you had that magic wand, what would be the one thing you'd do in the next sort of 3 months?
Yeah, and I think two sides to it. I think on the leadership side, a magic wand would be almost having like an experienced version of TED Talks that can be used to educate all the leaders across South Africa so that every single experienced practitioner can start to feel empowered by their leaders. That's at a leadership level. I think at a practitioner level, I think the magic wand is to tell them they have what it takes. They have the passion, they have the skill. What they can do is just go out there and link up with different people and make things work. I think just on what the point that Roland mentioned, it's no longer about structure because we're working in a remote environment. Who knows what structure is there now in a remote setting? There is no structure. So, I mean, one of the biggest challenges in companies is that even though you've got so many people who are for customer experience, you're sitting in different areas and you're not fighting the same battle. And as a result, you're not able to make a big impact. But if you can actually now, with the magic wand, bring everyone together and actually fight the same battle, I'm a big believer in the adoption curve, innovation curve. I don't know what it's called, but the fact is, if you can find all your early adopters and create a movement with that, you can soon get the whole company moving in the same direction because you have the people that you need to take everything forward. And I think one of the biggest mistakes companies make is not bringing these people together. And they're too scattered to actually create impact for the clients.
Yeah, and I would agree there because, of course, not bringing people together is sometimes, is part of the, if you like, the Machiavellian trick of not adopting a more customer-centric way of being, is because we reward people by the measures, what they deliver against the measures. And if those measures are suboptimal, so I saw an example of that in an insurance company where in the claims function, they were being rewarded for the number of claims they processed and how quickly they processed them. So it's counterintuitive for those guys to figure out how do we reduce significantly the number of claims by informing the customer about they can navigate our systems in a better way. And so sometimes the behaviours that we get are the results directly of suboptimal measures, which might have worked 20 years ago perhaps, but they're not designed for our third decade of the 21st century. So Seema, in your role as... Sorry, go on.
Just to add one more thing to bringing people together. And there's a huge opportunity for CX professionals to bring people across the value chain together to break down the silos, but not just bringing people together, but actually making sure you look at gender diversity, you look at cultural diversity, so that you can actually create really customer-centric propositions and solutions. Because, I mean, I think those are some of the systematic things that have been wrong all along that nobody has spent time fixing. But now here's an opportunity for CX individuals to actually do that kind of work as well and get bigger benefit out of it.
Yeah, and again, swinging back to Roland's observation across 49 countries, where you're working with all these different cultures and different styles, the common denominator can be the experiences that we're seeking to deliver as an organization. That collectively can be a campfire we can all get around and all understand. So despite all the language difficulties, the cultural difficulties, things don't work like that around here and so on, is that common thing that we're all consumers, we understand the customer. So though we may be in functions which seem to be a long way away from the customer, connecting those dots, as you were saying there, through the KPIs, through the culture, through the style. And it's not a one and done. I think there's that idea that, CX is a mindset. And you see organisations who have that, and you see other organisations, and they've put a little CX department over there, and they're out in the wilderness. It's like you've put them out in the middle of the desert, and there's no water. How are you going to actually help them? So yeah, that's great. So let's swing back to our agenda again. So you're trying to remember what the third bullet point is. So how do you justify investment in CX thinking and practice to the C-suite? And for this, I'll start with Lizette, because you've seen it from both being a consultant, but also being on the inside of organizations. So how do you justify investment in customer experience thinking and practice to the C-suite?
I think having seen it from both sides was quite an interesting observation for me, because previously as a consultant, what I hadn't realized was the amount of foundational positioning that needed to be done internally by, my client, my CX counterpart within an organization, before they brought the consultants along to come in and do the work. What we're finding here in terms of justifying that investment, now that I'm on the other side of the fence and I'm one of those internal people that need to, engage, and I watch Mombi do this all the time, thank goodness. Mombi and I collaborate on the sidelines, and then Mombi goes into battle. But I think the justification really always has to come back, and maybe I'm thinking about it again from a banker point of view, and being in the corporate world where we engage B2B mostly with corporate clients. It's very much all about how the business is going to benefit. And so bringing it back to that triple crown idea in terms of saying, well, the justification for this client experience and this improved journey that we want to design is really a better experience for the client, but also it's going to drive certain efficiencies internally with the business. It's going to produce X amount of additional revenue. We're going to be able to, deepen our relationships with certain clients and increase the contribution that they make to the organization. So again, it's about talking the language of the execs and making sure that those execs can see directly how it's going to affect the bottom line for the organization. And particularly, in this COVID world, our organizations have all struggled. People have been laid off. I was listening to Flight Centre earlier when they were talking about resizing, but at least they're still in business. It's been really, really tough financially for organizations to remain afloat. And so we can't disregard that cost impact and the financial benefit that client experience should bring. So I think you really need to become friends with the data people, you need to become friends with the finance people, and you need to have those facts at hand to be able to justify investments in CX today.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned an approach there, the triple crown, for so those people who've not come into contact before with that. Just to summarise it, it was from a good colleague of mine, and a guy called Jim Siner, who worked for Gartner. And in the early days of getting CX movement going, like 25 years ago, one of the things they hit upon was that the people who were doing this stuff really well, they were winning the triple crown. And to summarise that, they were simultaneously managing to reduce costs, improve service, and in a for-profit company grow revenues. And why that's interesting, and I've been around so long, those things used to be thought of as being mutually exclusive, because people would say, look, if you want to improve customer delivery, there's a cost associated with that, so costs are going to go up. Likewise, if you want to reduce costs, we're going to compromise customer experiences. Whereas now it's actually a key linkage that we sort of see, like the top 20 global CX companies who are living, eating and breathing this and setting an example for the rest of us. They're driven by the triple crown. So to that point, Seema was making earlier on about, more about hearts and minds as well. Linking that together with that shows the justification for the benefit. So there's some good examples there. So thanks, Lizette, for raising that. But I also think your unique position is knowing how consultants would pitch clients in organisations, but then being on the receiving end of that and going, no, I know that tactic. I've been there. I've done that. And then at the same time, look, go away. We want the really good ones. That type of thing. Good. So Roland, swings over to you now again. He said, what was the question?
No. I'm of the opinion is you don't justify anything, just do it and show them. But I think one of the most profound things that I actually remember you saying, Steve, and I can't remember the research article, was that was about the cause of work in an organization. I don't know if you remember that. and how everything a customer does is actually the cause of work in your organization, right? So I've actually used that quite effectively, but literally spending hours in boardrooms, drawing up processes and showing people how if you eliminate certain things, how the work inside the organization actually goes away. So I think, again, I'm a firm believer of do it and then show the example. But to Lizette's point, it's not just about cutting costs. It is about improving revenues as well. And we've seen it now with our ability in our contact centers. You know, we've stripped processes down to the bare bones. We've taken out all the work that customers have to do. Our calls are coming down by 20, 30% a year. What are these guys doing? They're having conversations. And so sales numbers are going up. And you know, and then customer experience scores. My colleague Marlon presented this morning that on those sales scores, on the sales calls, customer sentiment is actually 20% higher on all the others because it's a conversation. It's not an issue or a sales hard sell. So there's the example, literally, of taking the process, slimming it down, making sure customers don't have to do the work, turn that into something that is a conversation about the customer. Sales go up, costs go down, experiences improve. I mean. And if that doesn't work, take them and show them somewhere it's actually worked. I think find a way to go into other organizations and get examples from others. We can't be afraid to ask. I mean, the things that SEMA is doing around the community is fantastic. I think if people start talking, these examples become real, and the investment opportunities are massive. So yeah, well done, SEMA. I think it's some good stuff you're doing there.
Good. And I was taken again, you reminded me as you were just talking there, Roland, about, again, Tony Shea. I talk about him a lot, and unfortunately, as we know, he died last year, having set such great examples. And to that point, you were talking about having conversations. One of the things that they were noted for doing in Zappos is they actually threw out the automated voice response system. You know, press 1 for this, 2 for that, and 3 for the other. And his reasoning for that was very simple. He said, look, we want to have conversations with our customers because 70% of our business is repeat business from those same customers. Why would we want to push them away? And so I think sometimes there's a misnomer that, technology is great and it's fantastic and all the rest of it, but we've got to get the customer proposition right before we go and automate it. And so many organizations have been sold on the digital CX, but effectively, you know, they may be, if they're not careful, automating the mess. Whereas I think the example you quote there, Roland, and you know, the evidence of it that you've actually applied is, to Lizette's point, it wins the Triple Crown. It's all about the customer being everybody's job, as Luke Harwood has just pinged me to let me know again, to remind me of. So thanks for that. Moving on to Seema, do you want to add anything to that? Because I'm conscious of, when we were putting the panel together, of your sort of role right the way across all the community. Is there sort of a best practice? You know, is there are there things that you would recommend that people do more so than anything else?
So I think one of the things that we are on the mission is, we've looked at definitions. So we've started off with one definition, which we want to do various others. But the whole idea is, let's actually bring the academic world, the business world, and all of it together to actually look at the various definitions and see how can we create a common language across the industry for each of the key items like customer experience. Because right now in the industry, everybody uses the word customer experience, user experience, all interchangeably. Meanwhile, they all stand for different things. So one of the big mission that we're on is to actually create clear definitions that are very understandable, that the industry can use, so that you can also communicate the same kind of message to your C-suite and help them to understand what the difference of one versus the other is. And we've done like a high level right now, but we've got a whole list of them that we actually want to unpack further over in 2022. And I think the other thing we've tried to do is bring a lot of content that is very helpful, especially for people who are starters in the industry, so that you don't have to go around looking for information. It's easily available. It's on our CXSA website. We've got access to thought leaders that you can follow on a daily basis, because CX is not something you're going to get overnight. You're going to pick up bits and pieces over time. You're going to triangulate it in your head because of different information that you get. And finally, one day, you will understand a certain concept. And the next day, you'll understand another concept. So, I mean, for me, the biggest thing is, just making sure we understand who needs help out there, and then try and see what we can create on the platform. The platform is going to keep evolving over time. I think for a start, we've just put information, but over time, we're going to actually package it for what will leaders find very valuable, make it available in a certain part so that you know where you should go to. We had our MVP desirable version, but the plan is to get much more smarter about it as we build the database of our client base. Member base, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's great. And, I'm on record of saying, as I traveled the world, is Africa frequently puts itself on the back seat and says, oh, we're not as good as other people. But it's very praiseworthy what the CXSA is doing, because, of course, as we know, some things that work in America or Europe or Australia are not going to really work well culturally in Africa. And being able to offer that sort of platform for people to be able to engage around, whether it's to do with, I'll go back to something Lizette said to me when I was sort of saying is, okay, so can I learn different languages? And how many different languages, guys, are there in just South Africa, let alone any of the other African countries? It was an amazing number. And I thought, oh my goodness me, I'm pretty poor on Spanish and French. How's that for, a perspective? But being able to do that CXSA thing with that context of Africa is very powerful. And I mean, other parts of the world are trying to emulate it now, say in Europe, for instance, the same sort of mechanisms applying, because things don't always travel very easily. And I don't know if anybody else wants to reflect on that, in terms of the African experience. Lizette, do you have
Steve,
a view?
I just want to share one thing, Steve. For me, knowledge is something when you share, it multiplies. And I think a lot of the people who have been part of the CXSA journey from the start, they all believe in that. And for us, I think being able to share this across Africa, that is also a big thing for us.
Yeah.
Because there's no point in us holding on to this and keeping it just for South Africa. So we all are very keen for anybody from Africa also getting access to the information and improving customer experience in their country. Why not?
Good. I'll let you do a plug while you're on there, Seema. How do people find out if they don't already know about CXSA? Where's the website? What address is it?
It's cxsa.org.za, and maybe somebody can put it in the chat. I don't know. I'll give it to Pooja so that she can share it with everyone.
Yeah, and I would, strongly encourage sort of people to engage around that. Obviously, bring in sort of the international experience, but at the same time, you've got to put it through that filter, which is, would that work around here, or do we need to take a different approach? And not having one size fits all, because that's never worked, whether it's process, experience, whatever it is. Okay, so I'm keeping an eye on the time, guys, so we don't keep everybody in the room way too late. So let's just put up the screen again. So the sort of final bullet point, though, is what sage advice can you offer for those new to CX? Seema, you were talking about the acquiring knowledge, learning, looking at the things people are doing. Don't restrict yourself just to the practical. Go and listen to what some of the academics are saying. And it's not necessarily that we all have to agree with each other, but it's listening to those different viewpoints can help us to formulate a way forward. So I thought, well, that last question, what sage advice can you offer? So I'm going to swing it to Roland first to answer that one. So you've got you've got 30 seconds. You're in the lift, and the CEO says, "So what sage advice would you offer to me? Because I'm new to CX. What would you do?"
Lord, I can't offer sage advice, unfortunately, Steve. I can offer a perspective, though. I think we need to stop talking and thinking about ourselves as CX professionals and them, because them used to do it to us before, right? We're all in it. And the other is can we just start talking to each other? I sat in a room the other day with two executives who are trying to drive the same thing, but after the conversation realized they were measured completely differently, which is why they were pulling each other apart. Just a conversation. Can we please start talking to each other? And you'll see how things start. Everyone wants to do the right thing. Nobody wants to do nonsense, right? If we start talking, we start to align. If we start aligning, we start getting closer to the customer. We get closer to the customer, understand the need, and everything starts to filter back. Yeah, and that advice goes to most CEOs and CFOs and CIOs as well. Start talking to people.
Yeah, and it's the conversation, isn't it? It's that George Orr, not World War, to use that sort of old phrase. And I don't think it's ever been as, in terms of hybridizing the world and the changes that are happening, is if we've lost out anything in our virtual world, is those conversations tend to be way too structured. But it's like, having a conversation over a beer, and then you find out you've got a common agenda, and yet you're being measured differently. And that's a great way. Oh, with you, Roland, a gin and tonic, but there we go. That's something else for another day. Lizette, what's your perspective on that in terms of people starting out? Anything to add to what Roland said there in terms of what type of conversation should you be having?
I was going to link onto what Roland was saying, because I think that ongoing conversation leads to collaboration, and that collaboration around a common goal leads to results. And so for me, it's about having those conversations, getting people on the same page, and keeping it simple. I think we might have a tendency in the CX world to try and overcomplicate things, and then we lose people along the way. Half the people don't understand what we're on about. It's about just keeping the message simple, inspiring people. At the end of the day, remind them that they're here to serve the customer. I think we get so caught up in our internal stuff and our day-to-day tasks that we forget the purpose of us being in business and why we're here. And if you can create that inspiration and that momentum, and then pick something small to start proving results. I think, Roland, what you said earlier, just do it. Within the constraints of what you've got, right? Steve, you also said you've got to start where you are. So think about something that you can influence, prove something, and use that to drive the momentum forward. That can be really difficult. So do what I say, not what I do. It's really hard. I get that. But also understanding, I guess, a little bit about, for your stakeholders, what's in it for them as well, and how can you, push some of those buttons in alignment with trying to achieve a customer outcome, so that everybody wins.
Yeah, and I think that stakeholder thing you just mentioned there is very relevant, is understanding it's not necessarily just the people that are in immediate contact with, but there's a wider audience that's receptive and can be supportive in the right circumstances. So I think that's really good advice, building on start where you are, but start with something small. Don't try and drain the ocean. That's not going to work. And some people will set out with this sort of cultural idea in mind that we've got to convert the whole organization. And I think, swinging back to you, Roland, it's the example of that is you sort of build a team, and then the team goes out and propagates, and just as it turns into a rolling snowball, which sort of gathers pace, but gathers more mass, and then you find people turning around to you and actually sort of saying, why didn't you do this before? It's so simple. And you go, oh my goodness me, that's it. It's like that. Oh, right. How long did it take us to get here? For you to be telling us that we should have been doing this years ago. So I think that's really cool as well. So sage advice, and the reason I phrase the bullet point that way, if we think about our collective experience and we think about the ascendancy of customer experience, and there was that Google Trends thing we looked at yesterday, was those old techniques which used to help organizations change. It's not that they're redundant, it's just they're less important now than being able to craft and engineer, a really good experience. So going over to you, Seema, in terms of that sage advice for the new starter, you already touched on it, but again, with the just do it idea in mind, start small and where you are. What would you add to that?
So my dad always spoke about ask, attitude, skills, and knowledge. And I think he added on to it, listen, then it became LASK. And that talks, in this scenario, it talks about listening to your clients and employees and other stakeholders that you have in the network. Attitude, creating that outside-in mindset and always looking to create a win-win solution for the parties involved. Skill, I mean, the reality is skill you develop over time. I mean, just going for one course is not going to build that skill. And a big part of the skill is our human skills that we develop from the time we are babies, after babies, yeah. And so the reality is we're always going to come across new human beings every single day. And every single time it's an opportunity to learn a new skill within our human skills repertoire. And so just keep meeting people, growing your human skills, because it's one of the key things I think about customer experience, getting better at the human skill part, where communication is a key part, empathy is another one. Lastly, knowledge. I mean, there's so much resources available for sharing knowledge. CXSA is making available mentors. There's a whole lot of thought leadership. And reach out to people, because I mean, you ask and the worst thing they can say is no, they don't have time. But I mean, the best thing is you will be able to build a relationship and take it forward, and which will be a life-changing relationship. So yeah, I think that's my 3 letters, 4 letters, sorry.
But I like that knowledge thing, because there's really no place to hide in terms of finding out how other people are doing this stuff, and then being able to, not reinvent the wheel, but being able to actually sort of take some of those best practices and incorporate them into our world. And I was taken with going back to sort of some of the early definitions of this, and inspired by Southwest Airlines, and they were talking about, it's not what you do that defines you, it's what you deliver. So if you find other people who are delivering the same thing, and they said, for instance, yes, we're in aviation, but we're really in the business of moving people. So in their instance, it was a case of, let's go and find out who else is moving people. And they went to Cirque du Soleil, they were moving people emotionally. And let's look at how they do customer onboarding and see if there's things we can learn from that. So I think we're in that stage now where we're not trapped into an industry or a vertical anymore. CX gives us that capacity to actually sort of say, well, outside of our industry, but people doing a similar business, how do they do it, and how could we internalize some of that? So I've always thought when people sort of say, where should I start, and it's exactly to what you were saying, Seema. It's go and sort of upskill your knowledge. It's go and find out how other people are doing this, and it's an easy path for learning.
And Steve, just to add one more to what you're mentioning, in the past, people didn't have Google and all of that to find information, but we were living in such different times. I mean, if I look at the amazing story about Southwest Airlines right now, they've survived COVID and they're still doing quite well because of everything they've put in place as foundation. I mean, any company can read up on what they've done, see how they've done culture. We don't need to make the same mistakes, because we've got technology that will help us get access to all this information. Maybe what we just need is more platforms like X-Talk and other engagement opportunity to share this knowledge so that it's packaged and made available for people in South Africa or South Africa. Yeah.
Absolutely right on. Well, I think we've reached the end of our bullet points, and we're coming up against time. So I don't know if there's, Pooja, you've got any sort of questions that have arisen from delegates. I've been watching the chat room, but any specific questions that people want to sort of put to the panel while we have them trapped in this virtual room?
That is all that we have from the question and answers that I've put on the chat room. Anything extra something extra has not come in, but then if there are any questions, we'll connect you with them offline.
Fantastic, good. Well, panel, I've really enjoyed sort of being with you, and again, that different perspectives is really valuable for everybody who's been at the conference, I think, and there's a takeaway for all of us. So summarising that, upskill your knowledge, start where you are, and just do it. So there's no reason why we don't. And let's see ourselves back here in a few months' time, and we can have some other panelists here answering similar ways, but giving us some other pearls of wisdom as well. So thanks, guys. Okay. Pooja, back over to you, please.